If you experience anxiety and are constantly getting triggered by everything, you need to watch this video. So when you're struggling with anxiety, you may notice things that never really triggered you all of a sudden trigger you. The smallest things that used to be effortless for you, are now all of a sudden being triggering. And it could be like an over-exaggerated response and you're like, oh my God, why is that happening? So what happens as a consequence is you avoid it. You're like, oh wow, that triggered me too hard. That was just too intense. And so you end up running away from it, or you don't do whatever it is. Now, one of the interesting things that happens when you avoid a trigger is something happens to the anxiety, and that term is it generalizes. So let's say, for example, someone has a panic attack in the car. And so what happens is they naturally just stop driving. They say, every time I go into a car, I get a panic attack. Well, then what happens is that now they are going into an elevator. And now they experience a panic attack in an elevator. Now they have a panic attack when they're in the shower. Now they have a panic attack when they're in the small room. And so what happens is the anxiety ends up generalizing. So what are people trying to do? They're trying to do everything to avoid the trigger. They don't want to face the trigger because it creates such an over-exaggerated anxiety response that they're just like, I just don't want to deal with it, so I'm just going to step away. Now, logically, that makes sense. But here's the thing. When it comes to anxiety recovery, going back to living without these symptoms, it's not about avoiding. See, remember, anxiety is about survival. It's about keeping you alive. And so if there's a situation where you feel like there's a threat, your body and mind are going to take almost like a screenshot of it. And so anytime it's in a similar environment that feels like it's kind of like the one that you felt like there was a threat, well, what it's going to do is that it's going to trigger that same response. This is why it's so easy to naturally respond to, oh, okay, well, that's anxiety. I don't want to face it. And then what ends up happening is it actually ends up reinforcing the cycle. In fact, this is how people become agoraphobic. Agoraphobia means you can't leave your house. It's not that they're afraid of leaving their house. What they're afraid about is what happens if anxiety creeps up. What happens if they get triggered outside and they have no place to go where they can't run away. But here's the thing. If you're focused on overcoming anxiety, meaning you're no longer feeling these symptoms, you're going back to living freely, anxiety is just not something you even think about. Well, the key is not actually avoiding your triggers, but going towards it. See, the reason why people run away from it is because they don't know how to respond to a trigger. So if something scares them, they respond in fear. Now, it's that fear that reinforces the cycle. But if you learn how to respond correctly, if you learn how to focus on long-term freedom, well, the consequences is that the triggers end up going away. Now, if you're not getting triggered by anything, it's natural to go back to living, right? Because anxiety is just not a problem. And if you really want to learn more, follow this page for more.